but I left a long time ago. But I do come back almost every year, except for the COVID years. I thought I would talk on a different topic this time. Miss Lim Huang Huang is my teacher from the Penang Free School. So thank you for coming. Many of you may be confused also. There between myself and Danny Kwa, you know. So Danny Kwa is a good friend. He is the Vice President of the Economic Society of Singapore. He is also from Penang Free School. The difference is that he is 1 year my senior at the Penang Free School. But we do get together many times in Singapore. So whenever I give a talk, the first thing people ask me is, am I related to Danny? And so I want to clear this immediately. We are not related, but we are related via the school. Okay, so I thought about doing a different topic this time. The first topic I did last year was on looking at the power of cost-benefit analysis and how people, government, firms make decisions, and how that is useful for government in order to rationalize our allocation of scarce resources. I've also been interested in environmental things and applying cost-benefit analysis to things. So one of the things I have been interested in for many years now is on the high cost of air pollution. So this topic today is about air pollution. The title of this topic was picked actually by my good friend, Dato' Yu, over there. And the title is Unmasking Air Pollution. I thought it was a very interesting title, the word unmasking. You know? Now, there are many slides here, many slides. For those of you who want a copy of the PPT slides at the end of the talk, you can, of course, get it from the organizers. I give you full permission as long as you quote this from the talk. Now, I won't be using every slide that I have here because it's just too long. Because this is same slides, but for different types of audience. I looked at the Malaysian case of air pollution, and you can see, right, when the transboundary haze hits us, KL, you know, this picture is taken from the, I think it's from the Star. They talked about the air pollutant index in Penang. Readings have all gone up. The sources of air pollution in Malaysia, for those of you who may not know, comes from mainly power generation and industrial manufacturing. Vehicles, as usual, do contribute to air pollution, and open burning activities. The citation for the references for this come from these two Malaysian sources. And continuing with this citation of these two sources, they did studies on the cost of air pollution in Malaysia and how it affects health and how this in terms affects rising economic costs. So costs are incurred from health spending, medical costs, treatment costs, loss of income, lost productivity, and the estimated annual economic cost is Malaysian $303 billion in 2019, which is almost 20% of the GDP. That's quite high. So here, the diagram here, table here, right? So this one just tells you the observed case, current, and the WHO guidelines in two different years, 2005 and 2021. So if they had followed the WHO guidelines in this, then you can see there's quite a big difference, these two, with this current status. This is a paper which I published in 2021, Journal of Asian Economics. So I'll talk about this later on, but just to share with you. So this talk will remind us of the following, that air pollution harms not only environment and public health, but also through it reduces economic growth and productivity. I want to update you on the recent literature on air pollution studies, share some studies which are done by me and my fellow researchers, and answer basically questions like what can we do about air pollution, looking at different types of air pollution indicators, and what should be an effective policy that helps to achieve some optimal level of air pollution, taking into account not just the damages from air pollution, but the cost of controlling air pollution. So why is this topic very important? I think it's important for the following reasons. One is that there's an economic term called negative externalities, which simply means third-party effects. So you have legalized economic activities going on, but we are not party to this activity, but this activity generates harm to the rest of us. So that's a term of the word externalities is used in economics, and they are negative. And this affects, of course, produces mortality, death, morbidity, sickness, injury, and reduced life expectancy. It decreases the productivity of the workers, and it causes people searching for places to go, to change jobs, change place, frictional unemployment. It causes, for some people, asthma, allergies, all kinds of discomfort. And it is related also to the air pollution affected by transboundary haze, especially coming from Indonesia. And there's also air pollution from indoor, especially when people do cooking, right? And if you are using wood, for example. And all this adds up to global warming, right? So all this can stem from this idea that air pollution causes negative externalities on all of this. And the other important thing is to try to estimate this cost air pollution. It's no use people talking about high cost, But to policymakers, they must know what is the actual cost, what is estimated, so they can do something about it. If it's not so important, not so high, then they don't really need to expend so much resources. But if it's really high, then they need to spend resources to reduce this air pollution. But many people forget that there are two costs to air pollution. One is the cost that we are used to seeing from the media, the cost that of people get affected by air pollution, by health, right? But there is also the cost of controlling air pollution. So one is the cost the air pollution inflicts on all of us, including buildings becoming more dirtier and so on. But there's the other cost that you want to fix it, so society must spend resources. And that itself is a cost. And it makes no sense if society spends more than the actual cost on damages. And if you spend less, the damages, that's also not right. So in economists like to think of the term optimality, equilibrium, balancing, moderation, right? That kind of thing. Now, we all know that economic growth and development is very important, especially for less developed countries, developing nations. We all want economic growth and development. What's the use of having a lot of resources, but they're not touched to help the people? If you see a lot of forests, it's nice, but you don't convert some of that to help society, uplifting their standards of living, providing sanitation, infrastructure, support, and so on, then what's the use of having all this greenery around us? So we need economic growth and development. Problem is, of course, we know it leads to more and more air pollution from industries, from deforestation. We all know that, right? And for those countries which are advanced and already developed, for them, they prefer a higher quality of life. Not so much as continue to build their income and standard of living, but they want a higher quality of life. And of course, having good environmental quality is important. So they would prefer, of course, lower level air pollution. So in order to understand air pollution properly and to derive this optimal level of pollution, we need to estimate the cost of air pollution. We need to determine what are the factors which affect this level, how much to spend to reduce it, what are the policy instruments the government can use. And we need to reduce both the cost of damage from air pollution and the cost of controlling air pollution. To the layman, we all think of we should have no pollution. That's wrong. We must have some pollution. So to an economist, we're always thinking about what is the optimal level of pollution. If you have zero pollution, then nothing moves. You can't drive a car. You can't fly. All these things also bring benefits to all of us, right? But air pollution is the side effect of those activities. And therefore, we must try to look at, are we overdoing these activities such that it adds so much to air pollution and it harms us even more? So we are trying to balance. It's just like saying crime rate. We all don't want crime. Nobody likes crime. But you take a country, right? Let's say you take a country, my own country, Singapore, right? Where the crime rate is actually quite low because the enforcement, all the procedures to combat crime is quite high, right? Can we push it to zero crime? We might be able to. We put in more sensors, hire more police, everything, we can do that. But this is costly to society because we are already achieving a certain rate. To push it beyond that rate is actually very costly. So most laymen doesn't appreciate this. They want zero pollution, zero crime rate. You can do it, can get to quite near zero, but do you want to do it? So that's the question which economists differs from the layman. I want to introduce this environmental Kuznets curve. But just introduction. So this guy, Simon Kuznets, won the Nobel Prize for Economics back in the early part of the 20th century, where his main job was about constructing national income accounts, what we call GDP, GNP. So Simon Kuznets was the guy who did all this, and he got the Nobel Prize. But one of the things he did in his work was to draw a curve, right? And the curve is an inverted U-shaped curve. And he connected between income on the one hand and income inequality on the other hand. So his main argument is that when incomes are low, income inequality is low. But there will come a time when income continues to grow and grow and grow, then income disparity will go up and up and up and up. But there will come a time, right, where we reach a certain level of income, everybody's income is growing, right? And we do correction measures also for income disparity, then you will start to turn. And so an environmental economist by the name of Philip Grossman in 1992 drew the same curve, an inverted U-shape. But this time he connected between income and pollution. Income and pollution. So like this, like a inverted U-shape. Pollution here, income per capita here. So when incomes are low, you have lots of trees not cut, a lot of land not developed. You picture an African country or Laos, for example. Incomes are low. What is their pollution level? Must be quite low because there's not much economic activities going on. So when incomes rise, more cars on the road, more factories, more infrastructure built, income rise, pollution will rise with income. But there will come a stage in time where you reach a certain level of income. We don't know what it is, and it differs from society to society, where people have enough of food, of jobs, income, and so on, material goods, then they will demand a higher quality of life. They don't want so much material goods anymore. They actually want spirituality, environmental things, and so on. So this is a natural turn. It will turn. So that's a theory based on the Kuznets curve, right, which Philip Grossman adapted to environment. The interesting thing is pollution is a generic term, but there are many types of pollutants, many types. So for example, you have SO2, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, CO2, and the particulate matter 2.5 and 10. All these are pollutants. The question is it true that all these pollutants will turn like this? And so there are a lot of intense research by economists over the years to see, is it true or not? There is a curve like this that turns. And they found that it depends. Some, like SO2, almost all the literature shows that sulfur dioxide will turn. So they look at all the sulfur dioxide measurements in many countries over the long years, and they found that, yes, there comes a point when you relate with the income of those countries, SO2 turns. And some of these as well. But of course, this is not definitive because some studies show that they don't turn, especially carbon emissions, because it's much more generic, much more ubiquitous and everywhere. But I'm just reporting some studies here that shows that the turning point for SO2 for this is this amount of income. And these countries were studied, okay? But keep in mind, there are some studies that shows that they don't turn, right? And they don't turn could be, one reason is, like sulfur dioxide, we know is for sure, it's like from factories primarily. But carbon dioxide, carbon emissions are everywhere, not just from factories. So it's harder for it to trace a turn. But does it mean it never turn? No, it means that maybe in the future, right, we have not had enough years yet before it turns. We just don't know yet. Also, you can export your pollution overseas. And there's a theory called pollution haven. So you locate your industries elsewhere in poor countries, then you don't have to face the high levels of pollution. So you can turn earlier. This is something which me and my collaborators, a simple diagram to show that it's not just the one curve that explains everything, but rather we can have two scenarios, what we call race to the top. And this come about because we observe today's world, a lot of environmental groups, NGOs and so on, lobby groups, putting pressure on the government and to telling people to be environmentally sustainable and so on, right? And also the COP, the international meetings. So every year they have these international meetings, all the countries get together, they discuss, they put peer pressure on each other and so on. So all these things results in trying to push either the turn earlier, right? Or to get government to act to control pollution. So there are two scenarios. One scenario is reducing those emissions hurts economic growth. Reducing those emissions hurts economic growth. This is this one here. So the turning point has to be delayed because they haven't got enough income yet. Because if you are strict, if you are stringent, if you are enforcing all your rules against air pollution, then of course you will get reduction in emissions, but it will hurt economic growth, economic competitiveness. So the natural turn may be delayed. So that's why it turns. This is the original, A is the original point, but this is the scenario one. So become B, turns later. Now there could be a scenario two where the reduction in emissions does not hurt economic growth. It could be that maybe the government is very clever about efficiency, energy efficiency. And so if we make the assumption that it does not hurt economic growth, then of course, this turning point will be achieved earlier, will come earlier, relative to this original point A, may come to point C. So it's the green line that comes, it turns earlier. And this could be successful implementation of green technologies that we see today, successful implementation of government policy, lower cost of controlling pollution, and the businesses nowadays adapt to new environmental standards. So in other words, we can have a situation where we reduce emission by all these pressure groups, government following, international exertion, right, on the individual countries. Then emissions may be reduced, but it may not hurt economic growth. So the turn is earlier due to all these factors. But if the turn can be later too if the reduction in emissions hurt economic growth. So turning point is delayed. So these are two instances, an extension of the environmental good stats curve. Now, there are main indicators of air pollution. I'll take you through, some of you may not be familiar, right? So this is sulfur dioxide. It's a colorless gas, comes from coal burning, vehicle emission. Nitrogen dioxide comes from vehicle emission, energy production, carbon dioxide everywhere. And then the particulate matters 10 and 2.5. Quite small, tiny particles that enters into our lungs, settles there, affects us both in short term and long term. And PM2.5 is even smaller, even very smaller. That's why I say, we see people running on the streets everywhere. That's dangerous because vehicle emissions have a lot of PM2.5. And you don't know. It's odorless and it just settles inside your lung. It may not harm you now, it's going to harm you later. So it's better to run, joggers and so on, in the park rather than on the roads. Increasing attention on nitrogen dioxide. And I may also add methane. Methane is the latest that came out this year. But nitrogen dioxide is also quite concentrated. It comes from motor vehicles, exhaust, metal refining, and so on. And very common for all cities, developed and developing. It's often underestimated, the impact. So we need to address these causes for increasing nitrogen dioxide. We need to estimate this cost. Right? And this is also, we need to estimate, the other one is related to it, which is ozone. This is just telling you that London is among the most polluted cities in the world by nitrogen dioxide measurements. Air pollution imposes on society three impacts. The socio-economic impact, which affects healthcare expenditures for society, raises inequality, poverty issues, and productivity and labor pool. It affects environment, climate change, visibility, like in a haze, very dirty, when it's heavily polluted, cannot see. And there's a direct damage. Then public health issues, human capital investment, happiness. These are some of the studies, important studies on these three different impacts. So this is produced in case some researchers like to follow up and so on. So public health, you can see all these authors, the methodology they use, the results they found. I won't go through every one of these, of course. There's an impact on the economy, those studies that relate air pollution to economy, these. And those that affect environment directly. So air pollution in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, the industrial growth is less, so the lower pollution levels compared to China. But of course, it still affects public health. Long-term challenges for these countries. Why? Because no effective measures are found, except most countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei. At least they deal with the problem, they're aware of it, they're doing something about it. But in many of the Southeast Asian countries, they are just let it be, business as usual. Main sources of air pollution in Southeast Asia are vehicle, open burning practices, industrial production. And Southeast Asia affected by the transboundary haze, which make it worse. Indonesia is the main culprit for this. And there's also indoor air pollution. Indoor air pollution. And the sources are, well, cooking, heating, lighting, where many of the Southeast Asian people uses wood and charcoal. There's health complications from this indoor air pollution. Pneumonia, even all these things can affect lung cancer. One of the interesting thing, this trip that I went to the hawker center and I was talking to this char kway teow man, and he said, oh, not char kway teow man, it was the ban chen kueh man, the peanut cake. And he said many of his friends who are frying kway teow, they're all dying earlier than expected. So I said, why? He said, all the fumes that they breathe in. I think that's generally true. If you talk to medical people, they'll tell you also that when you have a kitchen, if you don't have enough exhaustion, powerful exhaustion of those fumes, and you're involved in cooking in an enclosed environment, over time, you may get lung cancer. So children and women are also affected because they spend more time indoors. 75% of premature deaths from indoor pollution, mostly in Cambodia and Laos. Okay, then subsidies like gas and kerosene are given, but they also contributes to air pollution outside, and subsidies for cleaner cook stoves. Then transboundary air pollution, many types. Air pollution from, what we call the yellow dust. This blows, actually it starts from northern China. And it, sandstorm, yes, sandstorm. It blows from northern China, northern part of China to inner Mongolia and all these places. And you can trace, from satellite imaging where this transboundary air pollution from sandstorms blows across, and also deforestation, and the usual culprits to it. And then the winter haze from coal heating generally from North China to the south to Japan and Korea. And of course, our famous transboundary haze from Indonesia. We are all preoccupied with this because we are affected badly from this. And I can tell you, I think my prediction this year will be very bad, just judging from the strength of the El Nino effect coming on. So usually there is, we can detect that the haze will be bad from several things. One is there an El Nino effect? That means the warming of the Pacific currents. And when that happens, it crosses, it's a natural phenomenon that comes every 4 to 7 years. And when it comes, then the conditions are right for very dry environment, dry weather, hot, scorching hot, and so on. Where you just flick a smoke on it, it will burn. The other thing is that whether the land cultivation is on peat soil. So it's a decaying organic matter. So if you put up the fire on top of the surface, you cannot know below is still simmering. And that's the danger. It's not easy to put out fire in peat soil. And many of the activities in Indonesia are actually on peat soil. Of course, the government has now come out to stop all these new activities, opening up lands with peat soil. But it's a very hard thing to control them. There are many issues with the transboundary haze. So that requires actually another topic, Kibeng, in the future. I mean, I've written a lot of transboundary haze. I thought I don't want to talk about transboundary haze here, but it is a very important aspect that people just don't understand. They make comments like, or we just ban all the palm oil, plantations. True, quite a number of the fires are started by palm oil estates. But you talk to palm oil people, they will tell you, we are innocent. Why? Because it's a tribal practice, shifting cultivation. So when they start clearing land with fire, the wind blows that fire onto the plantation. And the plantation is huge. And it's no joke, you can put the whole of Singapore into one plantation. That's how big one plantation can be. So how do you monitor all these things? Very difficult. How do you prove that they started the fire? They claim not just tribal people, but smaller plantation owners. How do you have evidence for that? Not easy. And Indonesian courts also long time before they deliberate on any matter. And their system of governance is very complicated, very, very complicated, complex. It takes a long time to change a bill and so on. So it's very complicated. Now, if you just ban palm oil products, but palm oil is ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're used in cosmetics, in food, in cooking. So many things uses palm oil. How are we going to ban palm oil? Then they said, let's ban those people who are not doing the right thing, not clearing the land with equipment, but using fire. First, you have to identify these people. Second, sometimes the products that they produce, the palm oil is just an intermediate product. It's not the final product. So it goes to many things, right? So those people who are good and well-behaved, are you going to punish them as well? Because they have different components to the thing, right? So you can't do this. You can't ban them. You can't selectively ban them. You can't take them to court because it's outside your jurisdiction. Lots of problems. And when President Jokowi came up with the idea that why don't we put like water moats around plantation, have a plantation separated by water moat to stop the fire from spreading, it's a good idea. But palm oil depends on dry land, Productivity increases with dry land. If you have a lot of water, the soggy, the palm oil productivity, the output will be very much reduced. And Indonesia depends a lot on palm oil production exports. It's a big revenue earner. So all these things, everything has a cost and a benefit. That's life, isn't it? The thing that we have to analyze what these costs are, and then we take appropriate action. In any case, this is not digression, but rather to tell you this. I have once advocated, Singapore provides satellite imaging, right? So we know exactly whose plantation is. We know that's a spot, basically. We don't know who owns it, but we know the spot where the fires occur. We can identify from this powerful satellite. Now, the problem is, again, the palm oil plantation that owns this spot will say, we did not start the fire, it came from elsewhere. So that's one. Two is, sometimes the imaging is blurred because there's too much cloud coverage. So you cannot get. Thirdly, which is the most important to the countries, is privacy issues. So once the Indonesian government cooperates and review and takes these plantation owners to courts based on your satellite imaging pictures, they will then reveal to the whole world who owns what, in where, in what part of the land, the size and so on. They're not willing to divulge. The same thing is Malaysia. Actually, Malaysia was an earlier proponent of this satellite imaging, but they also back off eventually. Same issue, it's a privacy issue. Now, so I have actually proposed a strict liability, not about privacy, but rather because they claim that the fire was not caused by us, caused by others. We are very careful. But in law, you have the negligence law. You have to prove negligent, that you were negligent, therefore you are culpable. But why not do away with this negligence law for this case and apply the old law, which is strict liability? Strict liability means as long as your land is on fire, you are responsible. You have to pay damages. So what will happen? You create incentives for the plantation owners to take great care And when they see a little bit fire occurring on their land, they will rush to put out the fire as fast as possible before it spreads. Because otherwise, if it spreads, the damages are high and you have to pay under the strict liability law. And also, you can also incentivize the local people, right? Plantation owner can incentivize them, give them money, give them something, right? Gifts in kind, to spot fires and tell and relay back to the plantation owners. All these things can be done if you have strict liability. So that's one way to deal with this. Another thing to think about transboundary pollution is that unlike local pollution, air pollution, we can quite easily deal with it. So the government, including Penang or KL, they can issue regulation. They can have a tax on people who air pollution. But you can't do that in another country. So that's a problem. There's a sovereignty issue. And because of the sovereignty issue, all our textbooks models that we learn on how to reduce air pollution through economic instruments cannot work when it comes to outside your jurisdiction. Now, that textbook model is what we call the polluter pay principle. You pollute, you pay. Basically, that's the idea. So, carbon tax, all this works in the same way. Polluter pay, okay? But you cannot impose this to Indonesia because outside jurisdiction, you cannot bring them to court. So there is another textbook model in our textbook we call the victim pay principle. Victim pay principle means that government provides a subsidy for you to pollute less. And if you look at theory, both the models work. The problem is we don't see the victim pay principle widely used, although it results in the same efficiency level. And so the victim pay principle now can be resurrected to use when it involves transboundary pollution, the sovereignty of another country. Now, all the time, countries which are richer countries, including Malaysia and Singapore, we contribute foreign aid to poorer countries. Why can't we think about foreign aid in terms of buying equipment to clear the land without using fire? So why do they clear land with fire? They clear land with fire because it's cheap. The alternative is to buy a lot of equipment, use a lot of manpower to clear the land. So that's why they try to avoid and use the clear land without fire. But if you talk to the small-time plantation owners, you talk to the farmers, they will tell you, we want to clear land without using fire. But we have no money. What to do? Even if you tell them we want to obey the government, we just don't have money. So that's where this thing comes in, the victim pay principle, where we contribute foreign aid in terms of buying this equipment to help these small-time farmers and plantations to clear their land. All right? That has been proposed in an article which I wrote and is published in the Yale Global in 2016. I can tell you, nobody liked it. Whenever I speak on this solution in Japan, in Korea, whatever, nobody likes it. Why? For the simple reason is that who are the perpetrators here? It's the Indonesians. Why are we paying money for them? That's the thing. It's a big hurdle, you know. But that is just a mind fixation that you need to change. Why? Because if you realize that nothing works, so this thing may work. And if you don't do anything, the damage to your economy, to your health, to your productivity is so big. But if you give foreign aid for them to buy equipment to reduce these fire hazards, it's small. The amount that you give as foreign aid is actually small compared to the damage to the entire economy. So why don't we incur the smaller damage, right? Pay this and we avoid this bigger. So that's the idea. But it's not acceptable to most people. It's a mindset. Because they think, no, you are the harmer, you should pay. Why should the harmee pay, right? So that's the thing. But think about it. Okay, the rest are other types of transboundary haze I won't go into. How long? 15 minutes more, maybe. Okay. Now, in game theory, there is a Chandra-Tauken's rule. All right, some of you who knows game theory in mathematics. So they talked about this idea of shared costs. Shared costs. So if the cost of controlling pollution is shared between the affected countries in proportion to their damages from pollution, assuming everything holds, they can satisfy this rule. So what does it mean? It means that I use this idea and I did an estimate published in 2004 on the relative impacts of haze on Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And I found that Indonesia, the damage is 93.8, Malaysia is 5.1, and Singapore is only 1.1. So under this Chandra-Tauken's game theory rule, requires Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore to contribute 93.8%, 5.1%, and 1.1% respectively to the cost of controlling and preventing fires in Indonesia. So if this idea of victim pay principle where we provide subsidies, then the victims are who? Is Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia themselves. Don't forget, the Indonesians are victims themselves, right? And they are actually the primary victims because of the proximity to the fires. They suffer a lot. Of course, you suffer a lot, the Indonesian government must also be responsible and dig from their budget to actually try to pay some of these damages. So why should it all be, of course, why should all be Singapore and Malaysia, right? So they should share. The question is how much they should share. So they should share according to this Chandra-Tauken's rule. So that's the idea. This is what I talked about, so I won't go into that again. And the alternative to victim pay and so on, then we need to mitigate and we need to adapt, just like climate change. This is a study done in 2015, which has just recently been published in 2021, myself, my collaborators, where we estimate what is the impact of the transboundary haze on Singapore in 2015. 2015 was actually a bad year. I think for one whole week, there was intense haze episodes, which causes so much impact on health, especially. So the total cost of the haze, which lasted this 2 months, is 1.83 billion or 468 per capita. Then we computed the health cost, productivity cost, how much occupies part of the total cost. And we also did a study on how much the average Singaporean resident would pay to be haze-free for 1 month. And using some economic methods, we found this is the amount they will pay. And this is the amount they will pay for adaptation policies. For example, adaptation are like dissemination of information costs, provision of face masks, subsidized healthcare, work from home programs, and so on and so forth. So they're willing to pay this for 1 month for adaptation policies, and so on and so forth. This one is the first study on the economic cost of air pollution on health in Singapore. So this was the Singapore government acknowledged my work in 2003, where we studied how does air pollution affect public health using PM10. At that time, PM10 was a big thing, indicator. So we used this method called the dose response function and adapted from these two people. And we come up with the economic cost of health damages. And these are total cost on mortality and morbidity, right? And it's the cost of the percentage of GDP. And this is the per capita cost. This is just for interest. No need to get too deep into it, but just for interest. This was another study I did with my collaborator, now with PM 2.5. So instead of PM10. Okay, and so we then compared, of course, PM10 and PM 2.5. And because Singapore does not have indigenous studies, primarily to, let's say, what is the value of a statistical life? People die from asthma, from all these air pollution things, right? So even if you have one death, what is the value of that one death? Singapore doesn't have these studies. So we have to use what we call a benefit transfer method. where we identified studies done in other countries and we bring those to Singapore, we standardize it, we use exchange rate conversion, inflation, whatever. Then we got some based on the formula, then we compute the value of the lost lives, then we plus the value of the medical treatment costs and health costs. And we found that health costs from PM2.5 is actually more significant than PM10. We also look at the ADB study, Asian Development Bank study, and their study is actually a lower bound because they only touch on cause of illness, only cause of illness, nothing to do with mortality. So we argue that there's a need to incorporate indigenous data, local done studies. And this one is we studied ozone and nitrogen dioxide. Okay, again, the same thing. We did the same thing using this more or less the same methodology, but with data from ozone and NOx. We were surprised to find the ozone effect on health costs higher than the nitrogen dioxide. Again, we need a value of statistical life, and we borrowed from the US studies, which is to me not good enough, right? So we need an indigenous study. Okay, now I want to talk about air pollution also comes from cultural practices. So such as Chinese New Year, setting off firecrackers, all this adds to air pollution. And there are studies which did to compare the before and after air quality level, past midnight, before midnight in China, right? And they found that, yes, it jumps up. And all these gases are released during fireworks. Burning incense also creates high levels of indoor air pollution in temples, for example, in houses. You recall that, there's a famous temple here in Penang, which is the Kuan Im Temple, right? And many, many years, you see throngs of devotees go there, and they're all coughing and all packed into the temple. So a few years ago when I came, just to have a look again, and I was surprised that now you cannot burn any incense inside the temple, right? Whatever joysticks you buy, you put outside. You don't go inside. Now, that's healthier. That's a change in society's thinking about this. It's not a fixed mindset anymore. They accept that this causes fire hazards and air pollution problems. So they came up with a creative solution and moved it outside. As far as I know, no other Singapore temple does this. Only the Penang one is a good example. Hungry Ghost Festival, right? The Chinese, we burn the incense, and then they'll get lots and lots of complaints. Every time when that happens, letters to the forum page, media interviews, they all hate this incense because the wind blows it to all the apartment dwellers, all affected by the fumes from the burning of incense. So again, this is a cultural practice, religious practice. I mean, we respect all these practices, but in modern times, we are much more knowledgeable. We get more information. And so we should act on this and change our cultural practices. And then smoking itself is also bad. It creates second-hand smoke, passive smoking. It's a kind of air pollution also. So here I'm particularly fervent against smoking. I was on the anti-smoking board for Singapore government for 5 years. And we always are very powerless, actually what to do with smoking, except raising cigarette taxes every year. So you raise cigarette taxes, studies show that it does work for the what you call marginal smokers. I want to try, teenagers, they try. If you raise all these prices, they are the ones that will back off. But it's the hardcore one you cannot change. Right? So some smokers, friends I talk to, they said, oh, it's none of your business. I smoke, I harm myself, nothing to do with you. That's wrong, totally wrong. Because ultimately, something does happen in the future. Not every case, but majority of the cases, they will get some kind of burden with disease. When that happens, society has to bear this burden. If they cannot pay, if they are sick, they take up space in hospitals, and not forgetting their own family members are also affected because they have to take care of them. So all these raises cost to society. It's not, I do this, it's my own thing, it's my own cost. It's not true. So what this again, a negative externality imposed on the rest of society. And that's why I think we have to do something. And so this is a table that shows you some of the direct costs, the indirect costs, right? Of course, the lost productivity, lost all this medical treatment costs of hospitalization, and then they are related to diseases and so on and so forth. And society also suffers from things like, productivity is definitely affected. You take smoke breaks, you are away from there. So this gap of time, when you add it up over time, it's actually lost to the companies as well. And that in turn lost GDP. You may think it's small from your own perspective, but from the economy as a whole, it is quite large. So I published the first social cost of smoking in Singapore in the Singapore Medical Journal, 2002. And we worked up the first study on what is the actual cost to Singapore society from allowing all this smoking. Right? There are two ways to do it. One is called the human capital approach, where we looked at this actual cost to smoking to society, like as I said, hospitalization costs, medical costs, all these things, and indirect costs such as lost productivity from work and so on. But there's another approach which some people use, which is demographic approach. In other words, they say like this, from this year to this year, if there had been no smokers, there'll be no premature deaths from smoking. So they calculate the change in population numbers between the one with no smoking, one with smoking. And then with smoking means they have costs, right? So they calculate that cost. So this is a demographic approach. So here it takes you through the actual numbers itself, which you can read for yourself here, right? And in 2005, this study was looking at how smoking affects output growth. So there's an output growth model, which I built with some of my colleagues and published in the Journal of Developing Areas. And we look at what affects output growth, and we insert this smoking consumption inside. Then we ran these regressions and so on. And we found that smoking is likely to have a negative effect on productivity, especially for countries with high per capita cigarette consumption, which is what we should expect, and the numbers prove it, right? Okay, this is 2020, because I was quite upset with people smoking everywhere. They can't do anything. You talk to the town council, they say, okay, we will send someone down. And what time they smoke? I said, I don't know. They come in the evening. They'll send people down to try to catch them. But for more than a week, they said, we caught nobody because nobody smoked. Of course, they changed their time. They know you're coming, And many come out also at midnight, to smoke. And the town council said, oh no, we don't work past 10 o'clock. So how do you catch them? Not possible, right? And there was an interesting discussion in the Straits Times where people say, why not you don't allow them to smoke outside, but you allow them to smoke inside their own home, but you don't even allow them to smoke on the balcony because the fumes, the wind will blow, right? And so how to catch them? They said, you can use the CCTV, and then you can take the picture. Seems quite logical, but they can't do that. Why? Because of privacy. The CCTV will capture beyond the balcony and inside. And the law is clear, you cannot take picture inside. So you see one suggestion which is possible, but then become difficult to operate and implement it because of another law. So this is big issue. And so now they have created things like, for example, you don't smoke in the neighborhood. We'll ask you to we'll provide you smoking dens, which is away. But again, where is the economic incentive? If you are a smoker, you want to walk so far for a smoke, that's one. Another one is you want everybody to be congregate together in one room, just like airports, That's a problem because the smoke there becomes even more unhealthier because it's concentrated smoke. All the smokers are in that room. So there was a joke that somebody made which says, well, because sometimes some governments want them to die earlier. So less burden to society, Okay, so this continuing on 2021, I also wrote another commentary on anti-smoking, how it affects productivity and killing our economy. So what can we do? Well, it depends on what type of air pollution. It's not one size fits all. So I suggested air pollution cases, we can use mitigation or adaptation. Mitigation is what we've been doing in some countries. Regulation, quantity control, stricter monitoring, enforcement, have carbon pricing for carbon tax, right? For control of air pollution. Many countries, Singapore has its own carbon tax now, the first country in Southeast Asia to have it. And then sometimes we just need to adapt, buying all these things, adaptation. For cultural practices, we need to change behavior primarily. Of course, we advocate through the media, bring attention to people, but we also need to change behavior. We have regulation on company producing those fireworks, and in a sense, we control them. For the transboundary haze, I've suggested all these measures, which I just talked about a great deal. And smoking, of course, we still need to continue our excise taxes higher and higher. And then education and other kinds of disincentives. Somebody actually came up with a good idea also. They said, well, we will not allow our young, those who are born after a certain year, to buy cigarettes. As simple as that. Let's say this is 2023. Okay, we set a time. 2025, you're born. From that year onwards, you are not allowed to buy any cigarettes. And those people who sell you the cigarettes will be in violation of the law and will be punished significantly. So that's the idea. The idea is also that if you cannot buy and your peers cannot buy, then you're in school, whatever, it's just like, it's not a fad anymore. People just, no longer peer pressure. We all cannot buy, we all cannot smoke, that's it. So the thinking is to try to change the thinking. Of course, the implementation is a big problem too, right? I can now go underground, I hide, I have parties inside certain clothes. I ask my friend to go and buy the cigarettes. All kinds of things can happen. But at least we have an idea. The question is how to implement the idea, how to enforce it. That's the second kind of question. Last few slides, I don't want to talk too much, but just tell you there's a carbon tax now for Singapore. And we are our carbon tax is very low, $5, but then suddenly shocked everyone. By next year, it will jump from $5 to $25. By 26, it will be $45. By 2030, it will anything between $50 and $80 per ton. That's very high. And we are going to be closer and closer to some of these countries in Europe. And of course, you have to think, what does a high carbon tax do, right? Besides combating air pollution, the problem is that it may create a competitiveness problem for Singapore. So if other countries are not as high or they don't bother, then our goods become very expensive, our service provision becomes expensive with carbon tax. And that's why there's a discussion in the world now about cross-border carbon taxes. We try to have a uniform carbon tax across the whole world. Okay, I think this all you can read for yourself. So when you do the carbon tax, you have to figure out what determines the carbon tax, what is the amount you want to put for the carbon tax, and what happens if companies that get the carbon tax manage to shift their burden to the consumers. Then the inflationary costs will all go up and so on and so forth, right? Business costs will also go up. So again, rendering a lot of things in your country non-international competitiveness. So these are the costs of imposing this carbon tax. But if the carbon tax is too low, then nobody really cares. It's like back to business as usual. And so you don't change the mindset easily, right? So you just pay. If the fines for driving fast, overtaking and so on, speeding is very low, everybody just don't bother. If I get a fine, I just pay the speeding ticket. So the same thing with carbon tax. How to change this mindset? The only way is to raise this carbon tax significantly, right? And of course, the true carbon emission cost is actually not that low. It's actually very high. But taxes is what economists favor, right? And actually government also favor because number one, it's very easy to implement. We are all used to paying taxes. Taxes can be used for other things, revenue for government. They can be, offset some other expenditure elsewhere, and so on. The one that is more complicated is what we call the cap and trade, trading of emissions. That one is complicated because it can create offsets and so on, buying these offsets. That one, at least, but we know at least the quantity, but we have no control over the price. So this gives you a picture of carbon taxes. This one, I will leave it, is for those interested on China. So I have a few slides here on air pollution costs in China and the trend. So this goes on, and the type of mitigation methods they use, not carbon tax, not true cap and trade, but what they call the tradable performance standards, which is directed to only certain sectors of the economy. Some challenges they face, but the outlook is still very positive for China. So this few slides talks just about China, but I don't want to get into it here. Corporate social responsibility, those people in business, economists don't talk much about this, but it is important, right, for air pollution because it affects directly the cost of doing business. So if you have good CSR, you're able to manage and reduce this air pollution impact. Okay, my concluding comment is this. Okay, I hope it's not an anti-climax, but air pollution is serious business. It's time we sit up. It is serious. It's not just, nuisance, tearing my eye or allergies. No, it's serious business. We know the causes of air pollution. We do know. It's not something fuzzy. We do know. We know the cost because there's so many studies now doing on the estimates of the cost of air pollution. We know the remedies, a lot of remedies we have on our weapons, instruments to fight air pollution. The question is, do we have the political will? It's always the question. Of course, this is not to say that governments and leaders simply say, we don't have the political will, because there are other things that they have to consider, right? And that has to do with also like poverty, has to do with different sectors of the economy, inequality, all these considerations. It's not as simple as saying, we just do like this and that's the only thing that matters. And that's why cost benefit is very important to evaluate policies. Secondly, the second point is optimal level air pollution. We must always try in any given society to calculate and estimate what should be roughly. We cannot get exactly, but roughly. That's the equilibrium level air pollution that a society can tolerate. And that is a function of these two curves, marginal abatement cost and marginal damage function. And here is emissions. So as emission rises, the damage will continue to rise more and more and more, right? But when you want to try to reduce those emissions through enforcement, control of pollution, when you reduce from the right to the left, back to a zero, you go this way, then your cost of abatement or reduction goes up. So it's a function of these two curves at play. And it is where they meet, that's where you get the optimal level. Why? Because if you try to control emission, all right, let's say if your emission is E2, you can see the damage is higher than the control cost. So of course, this damage is higher than this, so you should reduce more. If you reduce below E1, then your cost of reduction for any level below E1 is higher than the damage cost. So just accept the damage, that's the idea. So you must strike a balance between the two. such that the marginal abatement cost in controlling pollution is equal to the marginal damage function in accepting the pollution. So that's the level that we must aim to get E1. So in order to get this, we have to study this, and to study this, study what affects this, right? And this can change over time. We need indigenous studies for every country. Because when we deal with mortality, we need to calculate what is the value of life. We need that. We cannot just depend on foreign studies like most estimates do. We need to calculate not just direct cost of medical care and so on, but we need to calculate the intangible costs. For example, loss of visibility, as during high air pollution episodes and transboundary haze. For example, recreation and leisure and discomfort. So during episodes of high air pollution, you are advised not to go swimming, not to go jogging. These are costs, real costs. It's not just a nuisance, it's a real cost. So if these are prolonged, this cost goes up. So we need to study and put a cost on all these so-called intangible costs. Not just always doing the tangible costs, of healthcare, medical treatment, hospitalization, but all these are important. Then we need to study which instrument is best for our country. So you take the example against Singapore. They cannot impose the cap and trade. Why? Because it's a small country. And most of the industries use the same level of technology. In order for them to trade of, buying and bidding for their permits to pollute, if your equipment and my equipment is roughly the same, then how do I trade with you? The idea of cap and trade is that if I'm an old firm using old technology, then I will need permits to pollute, right? Compared to a younger firm using new technology. They have more permits to sell to me, so I buy from them. But if we are about roughly the same, then we cannot trade and sell. So the idea now is to expand this cap and trade to countries beyond Singapore, to join this market. But it's not easy because you're dealing with other countries. Priorities are different. Okay, then we need to remind ourselves constantly that the cost of air pollution is not just damages, but also the cost of controlling the damages. These two costs adds up for society. And different types of air pollution require different types of solutions, not just one size fits all. Okay, so that's the end of it. I have 3 books that I want to share with you. This is the cost-benefit analysis book, theoretical book. This is an applied book containing 22 studies on all kinds of infrastructures and so on, building. And this one, I think, is more relevant if you're dealing with the air pollution and transboundary pollution, which is pollution across borders. And here we capture interdisciplinary aspects to air pollution on transboundary. In other words, geographers, scientists, medical doctors, economists, business people, they contribute to each chapter is very, very short, like only 3 pages, What is the idea? What is the concern? How did they bring from their discipline to this controlling of transboundary haze? So this is a book that covers everything from the interdisciplinary perspective, besides containing my articles inside here as well. So with that, thank you very much. I hope it's not too long.
Thank you, Professor. We have time for some questions.
Can I ask, one of your first slides, you broke down the major contributors to air pollution. And remember right, one big contributor was the energy generators, right? So since that particular source is quite a big percentage, why not the focus of addressing the issue be focused on energy generators? And I believe there are only so many energy generation companies around, so it'd be quite easy to target.
Well, it's true. I mean, that's why the carbon tax in Singapore, for example, is also aimed at the GENCOs, the big energy emitters. So that's all over the fact. And the question is whether these GENCOs pass on, as I said, about the incidence of the tax to the downstream users, so-called. And very much depends. if they're able to pass it, let's say to restaurants and so on, hotels, then they are in turn able to pass on to consumers, or the cost of inflation go up. But it is true that if you want to control this carbon emissions and so on, you start with the high emitters. And I think every country does identify these high emitters and put the tax there. Yeah.
Any more questions?
The graph that you plotted was very interesting about income per capita and then the turning point. I'm just wondering, as the income goes up, wouldn't such people with new prosperity, they will buy more SUVs and more air cons and so on? Does that not increase the air pollution, being more wealthy,
Yeah, of course. Basically, it's still that it depends on how you define. For example, this is defined as material goods. So when you say income that includes these material goods, SUV and so on, right? Air pollution will still continue to rise, and the income will continue to rise. Air pollution rise because they still need the income to pay for all these material goods at demand. So that means the curve will not turn. All right, until a certain point in time where they already have your SUVs, has your big house, have your whatever, then they will start looking for something which adds on to their meaning of life, and that's where the turn will happen. The question is, they themselves discover it, or whether they can be edged on by government policies, by NGOs, by lobby groups, or by external organizations, or the meetings that we have, the international meetings, whether all this can bring the turn earlier. For example,
Perhaps I want to follow up on the first question, Prof. On the tradable permits, some people argue there is only a transfer of responsibility from one area to another, where actually that is traded, and it doesn't, in the overall scheme of things, reduce pollution. How do you respond to that?
Well, for this cap and trade, this an issuance of tradable permits, the most important thing is to determine what level the society tolerates the pollution. So there's a quantity constraint. In other words, if the quantity is acceptable to a given society, and it varies from society to society, then society is saying, okay, we can tolerate up to X level of pollution. It doesn't matter if you get less or whatever, we tolerate up to that level. And they then distribute these permits to all the firms or to all the economic agents participating in this particular industry, to pay for these permits in order to continue their economic activity. You can't pay, you don't have permits, you cannot continue. So the problem with this is that there's a fear that the big companies will dominate the industry because they got money. If you're a small player, and you'll be edged out, and you cannot pay. But this cap and trade, although they fix, as I said, the quantity is certain, it's just that it results in other kinds of issues that come up. For example, how do you allocate the original tradable permits? So usually they just go by historical, and do you sell, and so on and so forth. But it's the way they operate and the way they think about it is different from the carbon tax. Yeah, very different.
Thank you. Will there be any more questions from the floor? Yeah, sure.
Regarding the haze, I think we also have our localized haze. That is especially after the harvesting season, slash and burn. So maybe not for you, because it's new for Malaysia.
Yeah.
How then can we mitigate with the political view of the government? Because on the one side, the government is against air pollution, and especially during the hot and dry season. But when there is a harvest during at that time, it goes on. So nothing happens. So how then can we mitigate that?
Want to respond to that?
I think this is concerning the Malaysian case. I'm not familiar.
Okay. I think, firstly, I think this has been talked about. Like you said, during the harvesting season, this is actually a cultural thing that we need to overcome. They have been doing that for a long, long time. And I think that is, to them, the most efficient method to return nutrient to the soil and the fastest method. Unless somebody comes with an alternative method of return nutrient to the soil within that short period of time. Remember, if you have 2 croppings or even 3 croppings as in southern Thailand, you really need to do that. But some suggestion has been forwarded to do composting, but this takes a long time. I mean, maybe 1.5 years before it's composted. On that scale, we are talking about the whole huge farms that is going to be doing this. So that idea has been thrown about, but I still do not know how successful that is. The alternative to that is that if you don't return the nutrient to the soil, comes the rainy season, that is going to go into the waterways and ultimately into the other environment. So that aspect needs to be looked at as well. We know now for sure from satellite imageries that during the start of the rainy season, we get all sorts of problems, especially from the Muda River, where nutrient flows into the sea, and you get eutrophication and fish kills. That does not perhaps uh, seem important to the land and paddy farmers, but it affects other sectors. For example, the fishing industry, eutrophication, and jellyfish, as you all know, which is enriched also by the eutrophication. So it is looking at things on a bigger scale and across sectors, which we really need to look at and not be very sectorial in our solutions. I hope that helps.
So looking at composting, I think is one of the most viable methods. But then, who wants to take the lead? It should be the government. The government, through their agencies like we have Maldi and so on, maybe they can set up their own composting plant, to help the farmers. So from there, after that, they can redistribute back the compost to the farmers. I think that will benefit. Is a win-win for all the parties involved. And also the win-win-win, I would say the public will also win. You look at like even along the north-south highway passing through Kedah side, there are sometimes when there's wind blowing up towards the highway, and then the whole area can be just back up, and it cause accidents. It had happened before. So it will benefit also others, the road users along there and so on. And of course, when the wind blows to others, the neighboring were affected by the polluted air, those burning. Then all this is.
I think yes. I think I totally agree with you with respect to Kedah itself, and also by looking at some of the way that planting of paddy is being practiced now, and the type of paddy that we are using to develop strains that are more efficient in terms of composting. Because if you're going to go through that line, you really need to look at the whole process itself. And I totally agree too that Mardi should be looking at some of these issues rather than, well, that is not our problem, there is another agency involved. I think Malaysia should actually look at it overall. Good idea, yes.
By the way, just add on to that, I think it's useful. Maybe the institute could do this, have a workshop, a discussion on cultural practices and changing mindsets, the role of government or the role of government policies. It's pretty quite interesting because there are some cultural practices we're only touching the surface. There are actually many more. We can gather all these things and we can have a good discussion and see whether actually the government is aware of some of these things. And if they are aware, they're doing something, what are those things and are they effective or not? Are there new directions that we can think of? I think it's interesting.
I think also this is one instance, but in the past there has been other issues. For example, freshwater fish contributes to a lot of our protein in Malaysia. But since the use of pesticides, we have lost that component. Yes, we have better yield in paddy, but in the overall scheme of things, you don't gain if you look at this discount in the other aspects of food production. The other thing which is also important is that we need to look at this thing as a process. We might not gain in the short term, but always looking at culture, it needs some sort of time to adequately improve the situation, especially in Kedah. I also want to add to that in that we are still using the old agricultural maps. We have not put into our maps the forecasted climate change impacts on our production. So that will come and become more important as when we have the dry season extended and the wet season being more wet, and we still use the old practices, and we are now getting to see the impact that we have not been too ready for the climate consequence of this. So I think there's a lot to be done.
I think although Maldives is partly to be blamed, but they've not done the research that they are supposed to do. People have gone into indoor cultivation of rice already. We are very happy.
I think in this, Vietnam is quite far ahead. We were talking about Vietnam during lunch. They have started to actually try out salt-tolerant paddy. If the sea is going to rise and our areas that are going to be affected are the lowland areas, especially paddy fields, which is next to the sea. And our paddy is, of course, salt intolerant. Shouldn't we be thinking about planting strains of salt-tolerant rice for food security? So thinking ahead, I think should actually, people look at climate change as a risk. But now people are talking about climate change as an opportunity. If you have the solutions to climate change, you can do very well. Sorry. Would there be any questions?
One of the great contributors to the problem is aviation. And I was very interested to have your comments because Singapore is one of the greatest aviation centers. And a large amount of the air pollution is contributed by planes that are flying. And these are distributed into what we call the commons. Yeah? And how much monitoring is there done for these kinds of things? How much control there is, how much pressure there is on planes to begin to change the way of thinking, and also people thinking about flying and the impact of flying. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, several responses to that. One is that, of course, we can't do without aviation. We need aviation. And some economies depend upon aviation. As you mentioned, Singapore is a big aviation hub and so on and so forth. Just like some countries depends on petrochemicals and refineries. And these are all undergoing transitional changes. So in the case of aviation, several things happening. One is the airlines themselves, the manufacturers, have become more and more efficient in the way they use the fuel and so on and so forth. They've also started experimentation with non-fossil fuels, right? But that takes a long time to go. I think the other thing is that they're experimenting is the issuing of the tax. There's a tax, particularly in Europe. And so airlines are aware of this, and they have to think of ways to be more efficient in the choice of routes and so on and so forth. And this is something which is ongoing. And as for the individual, it's a cost and benefit thing. So I used to tell this story about being invited to a talk at Singapore Management University, There was a big conference. I entered the room, and people there seems to confuse between the term environmental economist and environmentalist. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm an environmental economist, which means I look at two sides of the equation. There's a cost, there's a benefit, there's a trade-off. So I started by looking at the audience. I know all of them are actually NGOs, environmental NGOs. So I said to myself, I'm in trouble because the whole audience are environmental. And they can be quite carried away. So I begin my talk by asking a lady from Sweden or somewhere. I said, Madam, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Sweden. Oh, I said, how do you come to Singapore? And he said, I flew. Oh, then I asked a gentleman where you are from. I said, from Scotland. How do you come here? I flew. So enough examples. I go around 3 or 4 people, and the question is answered there and then. That people have made the choices. Why don't you walk? Why don't you take the train? Why don't you ride a bicycle and so on? I mean, it's obvious that there are benefits to flying and so on. There are also the costs. So one has to make this as a balancing. What is priority, Nowadays, by the way, I forgot to mention that in the talk, methane is a very important subject. Suddenly, short-term impact, but high concentration. And where does all this methane come from? It's from the livestock, as we also read from the media, livestock. So the idea now these environmental groups are saying we should eat less meat. That will reduce the livestock, and we have better health because we're all consuming plants. All right. So this again, what will happen to the livestock people, the people involved in livestock industries, the farmers and so on? These are all issues. It's not so easy to just simply say, let's cut off all livestock. And you see that in life, there are many of these as well. It's not so easy. I remember when I was a student in Canada, the government says, oh, we don't allow any more seal hunting. But seal hunting is a big industry, not just for the profit people, but also for the local people, indigenous people that depend on this. So it's a question of transition. How do you make people transit from one to another thing? Find jobs for them. What kinds of jobs? How you manage this? It's the same thing as people putting pressure on Singapore about getting rid of the refineries and so on and so forth. But this is not just the producers like Shell, Exxon, and so on. It also affects down the line of people working for them, engineers included, accountants, all these things. Have you thought through? That's the thing. But there's a lady also at the back.
For these complexities, for the ordinary person to begin to understand these things, would it be very useful for practical information to be given? For example, that if you were making a trip from Singapore to Penang, and their choices are driving by car, going by bus, going by train, going by ship, and having these kinds of your sort of impact on air pollution or your overall impact, you begin to develop indicators, indexes that then inform people about what the real costs are. There is so much ignorance about what the impact is. And I think it's this ignorance that enables big powers to do what they want, because they don't understand the impact unless, like you say, you're going to die if you're not careful. But I think we need more and more of these kinds of comparisons. Has some things like this have been done that will be very useful?
This is related to this issue of carbon footprint. So, I mean, there are programs that actually compute these carbon footprints for you. But of course, many people can't be bothered. It's just like saying, we are all concerned with our weight and so on. And so dietary calories, right? They also have all these programs where you just take a picture of what you're eating, and then the program will tell you how much calories. I mean, some people, yes, they like this kind of information. Some people like, it's a real hassle to know everything, what's life, yeah. But all you're saying here is that basically consumers needs more information. With more information, they can then make informed decisions, right? So there must be a provider, but I think providers are there. It's just that maybe people are not aware, how to access these providers. Yes, I think it's a valid point. There's a lady at the back.
Good evening, Prof.
Hi.
Can you share some of your opinion about Malaysian government legalizing fireworks and firecrackers?
Legalizing.
Yeah.
They have recently legalized it, right?
Yeah,
I think in
there are some
Singapore, we
news
still
about
don't allow it. Again, this is a measure of cost and benefit. It's a trade-off again. People in the old days enjoy this joy of setting off firecrackers and in association with festivities. And generally, happiness increases, utility increases. And we all recognize that, right? Especially with the children and so on. But the cost of it is from sparks and fires that may set off. And this is particularly dangerous. These sparks and fires, of course, will not just do damages to property, which you can calculate. It also causes loss of lives and injuries and so on. And some people get their eye blown off and so on with setting off this thing. It does happen. And there's statistics to show this. So one can, if you're rational, one can calculate and estimate what are these costs and compare against the joy and happiness of doing this. And this joy and happiness comes from where? Two things. It can be a tangible plus an intangible. Tangible would be things like the revenue earned to people who manufacture these firecrackers, and the people who work for these companies. All these are the tangible benefit to them. But this joy and happiness is much harder to calculate, especially with the indirect, happiness from seeing firecrackers being lit off. But there are in economics methods to derive such intangible benefits or costs, as it may be, to estimate this. I don't know, you study economics? There are methods that we do. Yeah, there are methods. But we seldom apply this to this context. So whether it's good or not depends upon the estimated benefits and costs. I've always liked this idea of cost benefit because you have an issue and you work to study what are the real benefits and costs. It's not based on some committee deciding whether they should be legalized or not legalized. So why does the preferences of that committee dominates the decision? Why cannot it be based on informed decision? It may not be accurate information, but at least it's better than what the committee therefore just decides. That's my view. Yes, Ling Hok.
Firecrackers and fireworks, I think over time they will change. The firecrackers that are actually machine make sound that is equivalent to firecrackers. I can share with you those are just after the talks. I have captured a photo and also video of the sound when I was a driver and I saw the machine. Okay? And as for fireworks, like I think some recent events in China, the opening ceremony, big events, they no longer use fireworks, they use drones.
Oh.
And this will come. It's economy of scale. Maybe at the moment it's too costly, but one day it will be affordable for everyone to just use drones to take fireworks. So the pollution level will be reduced.
Yeah, so that's correct. This is about new technology, reducing the cost of the fireworks and so on. Yeah, very valid point.
Maybe fireworks is handphone.
Right. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and always a pleasure, Prof. Please come again. We have a lot more to discuss. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.